Hello and welcome to another episode of PodcastDX, the show that brings you interviews with people just like you whose lives were forever changed by a medical diagnosis. I'm Lita.
I'm Ron.
Jean Marie is not with us today. Collectively, we're the host of PodcastDX. On today's show, we will be talking about the potential link between adverse childhood experiences and chronic illnesses in adulthood with Amee. Amee is the host of the amazing One Broken Mom podcast.
Thank you for joining us today, Amee.
It's a pleasure. I appreciate you guys having me on today.
Great. Could you please tell us, first of all, what is the idea of adverse childhood experiences? Are you talking about like falling off a bike?
Well, I wish it was that easy. I am going to refer to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. They have a lot of information about this, but adverse childhood experiences, and they're also known as ACEs for their acronym, have this impact on our future through violence, victimization, perpetration, and lifelong health. And working together, we're looking at how understanding ACEs can help create neighborhoods and communities in a world in which every child can actually thrive. But what an ACE is, or a adverse childhood experience, is any potentially traumatic event that occurs during childhood from birth, and sometimes even pre-birth, maternal, through 17 years old. And these are not falling off the bike, although that could be rendered traumatic depending on the circumstances, but are actually things like violence, abuse, neglect, maybe seeing violence in the home, having a family member who attempts or dies by suicide. This can also include other aspects in a child environment that just generally undermines their own sense of safety, stability, and security, and maybe something that interferes with the bonding of them between their caregivers, which would be things like misuse of substances, substance abuse, a mental health condition of a parent or caregiver, or any instability that a child has in their home, maybe from divorce, separation, or the incarceration of a parent or any other person that's in that child's household with them.
And Amee, can you tell us how have your childhood experiences played a role in your health and wellness as an adult?
Yeah, the biggest factor that, came into my world was I was diagnosed with rheumatoid arthritis. And when that happened, honestly, I had no idea that there was possibly a link between the chronic illness and that diagnosis with my own adverse childhood experiences and traumas. But over the course of time, as my knowledge in this area grew and I began to see research emerging in the fields of things, for example, like cell danger response, I began to be very diligent about documenting my flare-ups that I have from the disorder and then starting to correlate them to external experiences. And it was becoming very clear that certain triggering situations elicited an RA flare-up, and that these triggers were actually connected with these childhood experiences and the way the brain accesses these experiences in order to make decisions and assessments about our current lives today as an adult. And so what happens is that when placed in situations as a child that require us to learn, quote, survival skills in order to deal with those adversities that I just ran through, the brain writes programs in our software to help us automate responses. But also when children are living in a state of chronic stress, the physical impacts are having high levels of stress hormones being released into the body, such as cortisol. And that is where some of these other long-term health impacts actually evolve from. And stress is normal, and the brain knows how to re-regulate our nervous systems once danger has passed. But what ACEs and other studies have shown is that for some, when the danger is constant, again, like all those experiences I read off, then the nervous system becomes hyper-aroused and it never gets a chance to settle back down to a normal baseline. And then that's when we can see the long-term effects in adulthood in a variety of different ways.
Wow.
Yes, wow.
I wonder, don't you wonder sometimes which physician or researcher was looking at this and said, bingo, this is what's the cause of it. And just realizing that will affect the health and well-being of so many people. And as you're talking about this, I'm thinking of inner city youth specifically, youth that are possibly living in we live in the Chicago area, possibly in an area that has a lot of shooting and gang violence and the constant stress and the constant cortisol. I wonder if that could be indicative of a future for all of those people to have a heart attack as they get older because the constant stress on their heart.
Well, when you think about in the United States that heart disease is one of the leading causes of death, and when we ask ourselves, the question out loud, not everybody that dies from heart disease actually has like high cholesterol, right?
Right.
And so, we've all sat there and wondered, like, wow, that person seems so, so physically healthy. Why was it that, they ended up having a heart attack and dying from it? And so that kind of makes you rethink about the effects of, well, what kind of stress was their body on during some key development and growth as a child? And did that just leave them with a weakened system?
Sure.
And that's where this ACEs concept, comes from is, it's not always as obvious as, obesity, overweight, high cholesterol, or whatever. We still have some of these health conditions that are beginning to see that they may go back further than that. And they may go back into understanding what those childhood experiences have done and what the constant, hormone releases do to the body, and set it up for, issues later on.
Sure. Amee, are there specialized courses of treatment for somebody who has had adverse childhood experiences?
Well, there is some approaches to therapy, such as biopsychosocial, which includes looking at biological, psychological, and social factors that may have had some consequences or some experiences with it. But, having a one answer fits all for everybody, that doesn't necessarily exist, only just because we've all got different experiences, and we've also got a genetic baseline we're all working from. And so there is unfortunately one solution fits all, in terms of a therapy approach.
Okay.
Well, knowing about this adverse childhood experience, I mean, moving forward, we were just talking about how many people potentially could be impacted by that. I mean, it's going to be huge to see in the future what's going to happen or what can be done to help treat people with this, because it's not going to go away.
Right. Will the lifespan, will the average lifespan of Americans be dropping due to this? And what about the lifespan of Syrians or people in war zones that are children that are being misplaced, and the constant strife that they're dealing with? This is a huge thing.
Yeah, it really is. And, we won't really know what's going on today until we get about 20 years into the future, right? So It's hard for us to track and trend where this is progressing. When we're in the heat of the moment and we're able to look back, in time and look at the studies, the ACEs study is based on research that was conducted by Kaiser 20 years ago. And so it has taken 20 years of that study being published and then having follow-up research and verification done by a variety of people to see, like, oh my gosh, they're correct. Like, I'm now witnessing this in my own, side studies. And that's usually how these types of things become integrated into culture. And so today, now that more people are becoming aware of it, then it's probably unfortunately going to take 20 years of everybody now studying this to understand where is the trend going and what's happening. But you definitely raised exactly the kinds of concerns we have to think about is the fact that there are real impacts here. And a lot of our knowledge about this is only recent in terms of blending the psychological impacts and the cognitive impacts with the neuroscience and the nervous system impact and the physiological impact.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly. Theoretically, this could be an epidemic.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
It could be.
Yes. Amee, what treatments or therapies have you personally found to be helpful in as far as recovering from previous childhood experiences?
For sure. That's a great question. Now, I personally started with something called cognitive behavioral therapy, which is a pretty popular modality used by a lot of therapists and counselors. And I have a therapist that I see. I started off going weekly and then dialed it into about once a month. And then as I learned and understood about these connections between our acute stress response system, which is also called the fight, flight, or freeze system, and our nervous system, and how that can be connected to chronic illnesses and our physical health, I also began to adapt and include in some principles from somatic experiencing, which is a form of alternative therapy aimed at relieving the symptoms of things like post-traumatic stress, which I will point out that many children do actually experience this due to their adversities, including myself. And this is misunderstood by adults because adults don't view trauma the way a child's brain views trauma.
Mm-hmm.
So it's also effective also with other mental and physical trauma-related health problems, because what it does is it allows us to focus on what our body's sensations are, or the somatic experiences that we have. And so when we can start to take note of when our heart races, or in my case, my chest starts to tighten up, these become signals to me that something was said or happening that is triggering my defense system, this acute stress response, causing my brain to put my body into, and in my case, it's fight mode. And then that's when the physical, all the hormones get released, like the cortisol, into the body. And so being mindful of that and connecting it back to what's going on, it's kind of like a dual approach for me that I have found has been extremely effective.
Okay. All right. That sounds good.
What are some things that we can do to help prevent adverse childhood experiences?
Wow.
Yeah, that's a big question.
That's an easy question, right?
Oh my gosh! If
Right.
if everybody had the answer to that one, right?
Well, one of the things that's actually a stressor to families is actually economic conditions. Poverty is a stress factor. And, as we can imagine, if we've ever not had money and how hard it is to pay bills, it laces and weaves in everywhere in our mental health and mental wellness. And so if we can start by understanding how to strengthen our economic support to families and financial security and work policies that are a balance between a parent being able to go home when they need to versus feeling like they have to stay at work or their bottom line is affected. There's also really starting to change how we parent today. There's a lot of old ways of parenting that we're now beginning to understand are actually creating traumas and stresses. And so going to more positive parenting approaches, reaching out through the public and campaigns through schools and other resources like through doctors, and educating parents on this. And, there's even some folks that have suggested that if we begin to reduce corporal punishment, and creating laws that forbid that, because that's still something that happens in some schools, around the country. It's really important, of course, to provide quality care and education early in life
Sure.
to parents, and also to teachers and caregivers that are working with children, and that goes through child care and licensing. And right now, there isn't a part of our licensing and accreditation that looks at whether or not a caregiver understands the impact of adversities in poor childhood environments. We also want to always be working on enhancing our parent skills and to help them understand what is healthy child development. It's not just making sure the kid can walk at the right age and drink from a sippy cup, but what does it mean for emotional development and security? And how does that happen? There's a lot of suggestions, like, can we come up with outreach programs, that can go out to, like you mentioned, communities where there's higher degrees of stress and maybe gang violence and, other things. And can we get into those homes early with those families and support everybody that's in that family? And, intervention does help, and we want to be able to prevent that future risk. And so that's where ACEs actually started, by going into the pediatrician's offices and what could pediatricians begin to do with children and recognizing the signs of it early. Are there treatments that we can do that help reduce abuse and neglect? There are lots of ways to be able to attack it, but you have to come from so many different angles. But I think what's important is really, in order to be able to change that, is it does require a person, an individual, a parent, to have a growth mindset and an awareness of our own experiences first, because trying to intervene and learn new ways to parent is not going to be easy to do if you're stuck in your own scripts written by your own adversities. And that applies to parents as well as teachers, administrators, and anybody that has a connection and engagement with children in our community.
Right. It is a comprehensive, it has to be a comprehensive attack against all of the different factors that could be causing any kind of a stress on a child, from the school, the parent, the neighborhood. So I could see that. How did you first hear about ACEs and the effects? When you contacted us, I think Jean Marie is the one that mentioned, she said, how on earth could it can lead to cancer. How on earth can something like a childhood trauma lead to cancer? And we were like just befuddled. We kind of looked at each other and said, never heard of it, don't understand it, but we are very open-minded, so we started researching. So then we started looking into it, and we found out more about it. But very interesting topic. We couldn't wait to get you on the show. But when did you first hear about it and what the effects would be on adult health?
Well, what you guys experienced is exactly what I experienced, and which is why, I'm an advocate in this area, because I only learned about it myself recently, like as in early 2018. So we're talking about not quite 2 years ago.
Oh.
And it happened because I began connecting dots again between my own personal physical health and in particular, like I mentioned, with my rheumatoid arthritis diagnosis. And I was beginning to find research because I had a big question for myself, which was, why did I get RA? I'm a healthy, active person. How does it happen? Because it's such a rare condition. And that's when this research began to come out, drawing these correlations between certain types of chronic illnesses and childhood traumas or adversities. And then when I saw the TED Talk by Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris, which she actually did in 2014, but only recently people have seen that, just in the last couple of years, that's when I learned about this Kaiser study by ACEs, like I said, that was actually released, I believe it was 1999, 20 years ago. And so I'm like you and like a lot of people, this is new information, even though it has actually been, based on research that, is 20 years old. That's just how long it takes for it to get into, society. And it happens through this kind of stuff, us dialoguing together like this.
Right. I kind of wonder, do medical schools teach doctors that this could be a factor that they need to consider when they're treating anybody? It's got to start someplace, and I think the medical community definitely needs this information. And I'm going to put out a inquiry to the different boards that I follow on Pinterest and Instagram and Twitter. I follow a lot of medical schools, and I'm going to ask them, is this something that's in your curriculum? Are you aware of this? Is it being touched on just barely, or is it something that they really spend a lot of time on? I think that this needs a lot of time. This is something that's very, like Ron was saying, it could end up an epidemic because nowadays it seems like the crisis level that everybody is in. The school shootings that everybody is experiencing, the kids nowadays, when I was a kid, I'm going to date myself. When I was a kid, we used to hide under the desk, every Monday or whatever at 10 o'clock and the bomb warnings. Yeah. Because we were living in the Cold War era. And nowadays the kids are hiding from school shooters. And I'm kind of wondering, is this something that doctors are giving a good amount of information when they're training?
Well, Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris was actually selected as the first ever Surgeon General, I believe in the entire United States, but for the state of California. And her platform has been, because she has been one of the largest advocates in promoting the integration of ACEs into the treatment and pediatric treatment. And so, she's now the state surgeon general for the state of California with a platform that is very much focused on integrating trauma and trauma-informed care.
Good.
And there is movements also in schools to become trauma-informed institutions in schools. And, how do you get teachers to identify and ask different questions when you have delinquent students, students who show up to school and they are problems? Typically the approach has always been punishment, but now people are beginning to ask the questions of saying, what is really going on in that home and how do we intervene?
I hear you.
And so there is some movement, whether it's widespread in all medical schools at this point. I don't know. I think it's great that you're going to make an inquiry to find out how it is. But I do know that outside of the norm, everyday people, there is a really deep understanding that, our bodies and our brains are connected. Obviously, our brain is what runs our bodies, right? And the neuroscience has been emerging that's showing that emotions are something that's actually a function of how the brain processes and works. And it's connected to the nervous system. And so, of course, if your wiring in your house is faulty, the stove isn't going to work right. Sure. The microwave's going to be funny. When you look at it from that perspective, then it's like, well, duh. This obviously makes sense.
Right. It's a no-brainer, right?
Yep. No pun intended, right?
Exactly. Jean's the one that adds humor to our podcast, and she's in bed, so I've got to try wherever I can. Amee, what role have your family and friends played on your journey as far as healing?
Well, that's a great question, and I have to tell you that when you decide, as an individual that you're going to begin to explore your adverse childhood, doing it with family, to be honest, can be an extremely slippery area. Depending on your family of origin, you could possibly have an open-minded, compassionate conversation about what happened, how it impacted all of us, and how we all heal and move forward together. But unfortunately, if you consider childhood adverse experiences and you consider that list that I went through in there, they tend to come from families that have a variety of mental health conditions and wellness conditions across the board. And if each person is unaware of their own conditions, then sometimes the best thing to do is actually just to simply focus on yourself and your own well-being, since we are all ultimately the only ones who can do the work for ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
And that might be intentionally not including family into it, because they can undermine that process, especially if they're the source of
Right.
some of those adverse
Right.
experiences.
No, that's
right?
understandable. Sure.
Yeah, and then from a perspective of friends, that's another area that that can be very icy, because as you progress on these healing journeys and you become aware of your network and the roles that certain people in your life fill, which can be that they're playing parts of this childhood script that you have inside, this programming, this automation, and you might end up finding yourself also having to prune your social networks. And so this is a journey that most people don't actually ever want to even start on, because they have that fear that it can drastically upset that balance and structure of their current life. And that thought can be extremely unsettling for some people.
Mm-hmm.
And so when on a journey like this, you do have to be really picky about who you share and who you include with you, because it's a natural process for people to be uncomfortable with somebody changing who they are, and again, that role that they fill for them in their life, whether it's a family member or a friend.
Okay. Thank you.
Great. Could you tell us more about your own podcast and what inspired you to start it?
Yeah, I would love to. It actually had started off as a book idea. And the reasoning was that drawing these connections between these past experiences with the evidence-based research in the fields of neuroscience and psychology, that's really relatively new to all of us, like we were just talking about, was hard for me. Like, it wasn't an easy endeavor. I had stacks of books and stacks of research white papers that I was reading, and I was actively looking for it. Like, I'm a curious person by nature. And so if I had to go do that and work really hard to get that information and then suss through this technical information that the average layperson wouldn't even probably know where to start and read and find, I then felt it was really, honestly, it was my duty, I guess, to be the go-between between the scientific community and everybody else.
Okay.
And so, given the fact that early childhood interventions are so important into preventing long-term emotional and health impacts from traumas and adversities, it felt really urgent that I start doing this as soon as I could, and so that people who are parenting now could have opportunities to rewrite their own children's futures, as well as us as individuals, by understanding how these experiences, shaped us today.
Wow.
Wonderful.
Yeah, that's incredible. That very, 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 very nice. Have you found any support groups that you like to frequent, either online or in person? And do you think that those are helpful, or are there any? Because this is an area that's, I think, is underserved. So there might not even be any Facebook groups or any other support groups that discuss this. Or am I wrong?
Well, there are, but a lot of people approach these topics from a lot of different directions and not realizing that they're all connected together. For example, there are support groups for chronic illnesses. There are support groups for depression and anxiety. There's support groups for people that have been victims of domestic violence. There's, divorce support groups. They're all out there.
PTSD support groups, right.
Yeah, exactly. And they all serve everybody in different ways, and so they're all invaluable. Are they holistically viewed together as, gosh, these are all kind of coming from the same areas? Not necessarily, and that's a little bit of what my advocacy is about. Now, for me personally, I've always been in this position of being healer, rather than seeker of the support.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I think that the quality of the online support group can vary depending on the overall intent of the group's purpose. And I've joined a few with the idea of engaging and interacting, but I found that sometimes people are joining into them because they are looking for some external validation of their own experience. They're looking to be seen, and they're not necessarily ready to hear and understand what the change changes might be that they have to take to make that next step happen for them. And I find that I have to kind of step out of there because I'm more of an active, compassionate person, because I'm the place when someone's ready to change. So if they're ready to take the next step, that's when they come into my community, and into my space.
Okay.
And so for me, my support system is much more personal, one-on-one with mentors. And to be honest, the guests on my show that I have, the researchers, the therapists, the authors, are my invaluable resources. And so that's what fits me best, is that one-on-one connection. But that's not the same for everybody. But there are definitely a lot of different resources out there.
Sure. Have you considered starting your own Facebook page?
I do for the podcast, and I have started a group. I haven't engaged in it only because that in order to be able to moderate something like that, it does take time to be able to nurture it effectively. And I think, as you guys probably know, that.
Right.
And right now, I'm still, there's only one of me, and I'm also a single mom with 2 kids.
Okay.
I'm trying not to have any adverse childhood experiences on my own children.
Yes.
So, but I am always available for my community, and my community does write me personally, and I write all of them back.
Okay.
And so I found that one-on-one connection with the group, with my community, is working really well for them, and they know they have access to me. And so that's how I support everybody that's on the journey with me.
Okay. Thank you. What additional advice that you might have for our listeners or those who have had adverse childhood experiences? For instance, if somebody's listening right now and they're thinking, God, this really sounds like me, what advice do you have for them medically? Should they go to their physician and discuss the possibility of the connection, or should they go to their counselor and talk about the connection? Which direction would they go on something like this?
Well, I would say, if the medical schools are updating their training to include ACEs into their education, that's great. I will say that from what the current, the body of current physicians out there, it's going to be hit or miss that many of them actually still make those connections. And I experienced this personally with my own rheumatologist, when trying to draw a relationship there. So I always say, I'm a huge advocate for therapy and counseling. I like to destigmatize the idea that going to a therapist or a counselor means that you're broken or you have something wrong. And I know that's ironic having a show called One Broken Mom.
Right.
But to really scrutinize your experiences and understand the emotional and physical impacts that they've had to you is a difficult process. And not just because the fact that conjuring up the memories and the attached emotions that come with them can be very hard, but also we have built-in protections in our brains that can make it difficult for us to always be objective with our experiences and to note opportunities for healing and to understand them and neutralize them. But if you have a skilled therapist that you can trust and connect with, it can be a powerful way to improve your health and well-being.
Okay.
It's kind of like choosing to sort out your dietary needs on your own by either going to a nutritionist, running a battery of tests, and dialing on the right eating plan, or just reading a bunch of books. So, for me, I think that if you really do feel that this is something that is connecting with you, seeking therapy first. And if you're not ready for therapy, well, then certainly start researching chronic illnesses and childhood traumas, and you'll find some research and you'll find some communities out there. But I think ultimately to really tackle this aggressively and diligently, again, I advocate for finding a therapist that's experienced with childhood trauma. And there are professionals out there that is their bailiwick.
Okay.
That's some great information, Amee. Thank you so much. How can our listeners find out more about you, like your social media links, your website?
Yeah. So first of all, the podcast is available on any platform, any app that anybody listens to. Again, that's called One Broken Mom. I also have a website for myself, which is AmeeQuiriconi.com. And I know you guys will have
Yes, I'm going to spell that.
Quiriconi.
Yep.
Yep. And there, all my social media links are there. I'm on Facebook personally, as well as I have a page for One Broken Mom. I'm on Instagram at One Broken Mom. I have Twitter as Amee Quiriconi, and I also have a YouTube channel. So for people that don't actually listen to podcasts, but actually want to be able to watch clips of the videos or the full episodes, they can actually find me there as well. And it's also called One Broken Mom. So easy. Just remember One Broken Mom. You got it.
Great. Well, thank you, Amee, and we'll be including links for all of those on our website for your podcast and your YouTube channel.
And thank you so much for taking taking time, I should say, out of your day today to join us and tell us about ACE.
Yes, I appreciate, again, any opportunities that we can raise this awareness of this to as many people as possible is invaluable. And so I'm grateful for you guys having me on the show to be able to talk with you and your listeners.
Okay. If our listeners have any questions or comments related to today's show, they can contact us at podcastdx@yahoo.com, through our website, podcastdx.com, on Facebook, Twitter, Pinterest, and Instagram. And if you have a moment to spare, please give us a review wherever you get your podcast.
As always, this podcast is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Always seek the advice of your physician or other qualified healthcare provider and ask them any questions you may have regarding a medical condition or treatment and before undertaking a new healthcare regime. Never disregard professional medical advice or delay in seeking it because of something you have heard on this podcast.
Till next week.